千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together.
As usual, we identify the point where we left off last time, and then we take it a few slides back so everyone gets all caught up and situated, and then we move on from there. So that's the overall plan. And all the material that we have already gone over, we present them as a single slide all at once. So here's 21, and as I said, I think we will be able to get to 22 today, but let's make sure we explore 21 completely. So what we did previously was that we identified the sections of 21. As you can see, we have 3 sections. We have an introductory section. We have the main body, the middle section of 21, and then the concluding section. So we got through pretty much all of it, and we landed at the very last line with this. As I said, only 2 words, reflecting only 2 characters in the original classical Chinese. Okay, so in this last section, it is especially important to focus on the last 3 lines. The last 3 lines speak of observing the Tao, knowing the nature of the Tao. So let's do a brief, quick recap of what we talked about. So to observe the source of all things, so the source of all things is just synonymous with the Tao. So the ancient Chinese did not really know what the source of all things was. They could only tell that continuous creation, things coming out of nothing and nowhere, seems to be the way of the universe. So they call that source the Tao, or the way. So to observe that, and it's not something that you can specifically observe. You have to, when you want to observe the Tao, when you want to observe the source of all things, you have to observe everywhere, all around you. Then the next step beyond that is to know the nature of the source, or the nature of the Tao. So that's what we wanted to explore as we approach the end of 21. You can see that is particularly important. This is all about the nature of existence, the nature of this underlying reality, underlying principle of everything. So we got to this slide the last time, and we talked about the meaning of with this. So as I said, when we get to this line, I want to ask everyone to visualize Lao Tzu saying the last 2 lines. How do I know the nature of the source? And then seeing him pointing, using a finger to say, with this. Of course, as Lao Tzu holds up a finger to say with this, he doesn't literally mean, look at my finger. No. He's talking about, he's using the finger to point to something. What is that something? So the reason why I ask people to visualize that, because this is actually a long-standing, often used method of pointing things out in the Asian spiritual studies. So you actually see an example of that from a particular movie, a movie that I know many people are familiar with, but you don't need to have seen it to know what I'm talking about. So in that movie, Bruce Lee's character is speaking with a young student of Kung Fu. So he's instructing this young student in the ways, in the spiritual truths that underlie the study of martial arts. So Bruce Lee's character says, it is like a finger pointing away to the moon, holding up a finger. So the young student looks at the finger, and Bruce Lee's character smacks him and says, don't concentrate on the finger, or you will miss all that heavenly glory. You want to instead concentrate on what the finger is pointing to. In the case of Bruce Lee's lecture, it's the glorious heavenly moon. In the case of what Lao Tzu is talking about, this, his finger pointing to this. And that's a reason why we need to explore that concept of this thoroughly. So previously, we talked about the first level of that. When Lao Tzu says, how do I know the nature of the Tao? With this. This is a reference that points to this moment in time, this instant, right here, right now. So this is all about present moment awareness. And last time we talked about the reasons why present moment awareness is so important. It's about the richness inherent in every moment. It's about being free from negative emotions, which come from dwelling anywhere but in the present. You are able to deal with the chaos, which all of us experience and encounter every day. And lastly, and most importantly, the reason why it's all about this, the present moment, is because having present moment awareness means you can feel and directly connect to the Tao that is everywhere, or omnipresence is the term that I used. And that is how you know it's nature, because you can connect to it. So this is where we get caught up with what we talked about last time. So now I want to dig another level deeper into this. So the next level of understanding this is to talk about the one, or as I have it in the slide, the one thing. So first, this is a reference that points directly to the one thing. Well, what is the one thing? At the abstract level, the one, or just one by itself, can be synonymous with the Tao. However, it's so much more than that when you apply it to your life. It's so much more interesting when you apply it to your life, because the one can manifest as many different things, but it's always the one. So this is where I want to bring in Curly. This is yet another character from another movie. The movie is City Slickers. In that movie, a whole bunch of people living in the city slickers. Main character is played by Billy Crystal. So they receive a gift in the form of a 2-week cattle drive from New Mexico to Colorado So it's it's marketed as an adventure for these people living in the city to get away from it all, reconnect with nature, to experience life in a completely different setting. So they show up, they encounter this very tough, very wise cowboy by the name of Curly. So as they are in the cattle drive, they also chat and talk about whatever. So the subject of life actually comes up. So Curly, the older cowboy played by Jack Palance in a fantastic role for him, Curly says to the main character, "Do you know what the secret of life is?" This holds up one finger. So let me pause for a moment here and just point out that this beginning part of it, is formulated just like the ending of chapter 21 that we're looking at right now. So at the end of 21, Lao Tzu says, how do I know the nature of the source, the nature of the Tao? Hey, that's just another way to talk about the secret of life. And then Lao Tzu says, with this, and I ask people to visualize Lao Tzu holding up one finger, which is exactly what Cowboy Curly is doing. So then Billy Crystal's character says, your finger? So now you can see the parallel between the scene in Bruce Lee's movie, where the young students is looking at the finger that Bruce Lee, the teacher, is holding up. And just like Bruce Lee, Cowboy Curly says, no, not the finger. Don't look at the finger. It's about one thing. What is that one thing? Well, it's the one thing that is the most important thing in life. That one thing is the secret to life, because compared to that one thing, the rest just don't mean a hell of a lot. So that one thing is the secret. It's the key to it all. So naturally, Billy Crystal's character becomes curious, but what is that one thing? His character's name is Mitch. What is that one thing? Well, that's exactly what we're here to explore today in our talk today. Cowboy Curly says, and smiles and says, that's what you have to find out. So I hope that by now you have seen the end of 21 echoed in so many different ways in a Bruce Lee movie, and you might think that, wow, Bruce Lee studied the Tao, so it makes sense that he will present that as a lesson in one of his movies. He loved philosophy and he loved talking about it. He wanted to express that in his movies. So between all the phenomenal, spectacular action set pieces, all the battles, he wanted to inject a bit of the Tao philosophy into it. Cool. Yes. But it shows up in other places as well. This particular movie, City Slickers, showing up in a cattle drive from New Mexico to Colorado may seem like the furthest thing possible from that spiritual lesson from Bruce Lee. And yet, it's the same Tao that is showing up here as well as there. So we're going to explore the meaning. We're going to help answer Mitch's question here. But what is the one thing? And then Curly says, that's what you had to find out. Throughout the rest of the movie, Mitch is seeking the meaning of the one thing. You don't have to go on a cattle drive from New Mexico to Colorado to figure out the same thing. You don't have to rent the movie to watch it. We're going to explore that. We're going to explore by first starting with the opposite of the one thing, which would be many things. So we're going to do that after we take a mid-meeting break. We're halfway through our meeting right now, so we're going to take 5 minutes. So let's start exploring the one thing by looking at its opposite. Many things. When I talk about many things, I am just talking about the chaos that we all experience in life. And because in life, we're usually pulled in many different directions. There are so many things we can pursue, so many temptations and distractions. The more we see, the more we want, it's confusing. So when you study the Tao Te Ching, you see Lao Tzu making this point several times. Sometimes he phrases it as, the more we learn, the more we want. So the thing to do is to simplify, to reduce, to decrease the clutter, decrease the complexity. So the problem that we all experience with the chaos, with being pulled in many different directions, with all the things that we can pursue, the problem is that if we chase after several things at the same time, chances are we end up catching none of them. And if you do this throughout your entire life without ever waking up to the realization that you need to do something different, then at the end of your life, at the end of this journey, you end up empty-handed. Then you realize that this gift of life that you have received for the past 70, 80, 90 years or so, it's all for not a whole lot, or indeed, maybe all for nothing. Sometimes, for some people, less than nothing. And in general, never mind the end of life. Let's look at the process of life itself. We only have to look around, exercise our power of observation to observe other people, observe the world, observe society. We can see that the most scattered and unfocused individuals also tend to be the most unsuccessful, unfulfilled, and unhappy. And what I see myself is that a lot of them, as they live their cluttered, chaotic lives, they invent excuses for themselves. For instance, they may believe that they are creative individuals, and in order for them to be creative, they must have that chaos. They must be surrounded by many things. They must be in the middle of a mess in order to be creative. So I'm gonna have to disagree with that. I'm gonna have to say that's absolutely not true. One can be creative with or without clutter, and in general, being without clutter enables the marshaling, the organization of one's energies. So after you're done being creative, you have a better ability to put it together in a way that can be presented to the world. So chaos has nothing to do with as a catalyst of creativity. The Tao itself is the catalyst for creativity. And that can happen when everything is nicely sorted and you are reducing your life to a minimalist set that is joy-inducing and indeed creativity inspiring. So, looking away from the individuals who are scattered and unfocused, I would recommend looking for those who are the polar opposites. Conversely, the most successful, fulfilled, and happy individuals are the ones who know how to narrow their focus and attain a laser-like brilliance. And they know how to do this continuously. They know how to sustain it. So because they're able to focus, they are way more effective than the individuals who are scattered in many different directions. And that only makes sense. So let me bring in an actual real life example. I want to talk about a business leader. So this is in the business setting. A real life example, there's a business leader. His name is Gary. He became the CEO of his company, and he wanted to build his company. He wanted to make it as great as possible. That was his goal. And his company is in the real estate business. So he had a group of 14 senior executives, and he worked with each one to build his business. Initially, he achieved varying results. And what I mean by that is that sometimes the results will be fantastic, other times it will be disappointing. So as a business leader, obviously he wanted more consistency. He wanted his senior executives to be excellent all the time, spectacular all the time, or maintain a high level of performance to deliver month after month. But his frustration was that he couldn't have that, and it was unpredictable. Sometimes it will be really good, sometimes it will be really awful. So he observed how everybody worked, and he noticed an interesting thing. He noticed that while all of these executives are hardworking people, they were all diligent. They all had a lot to do, and they would all manage to get most things done week after week. And they would be, and they would, if they did not get good results, they would be hard on themselves, and they would push even further to get more done. Now, the key insight for Gary, the CEO, was that even though his senior executives got a great quantity of things done, what was done were not necessarily the most important stuff. Sometimes the most important stuff were missed, and as a result, the company suffered. So he wanted to get a handle on this. So he decided that he needed a new approach. He wanted to whittle down all the things that people had to do. He wanted to identify the most important among them. So as he sat down with the senior executives individually every week, he would try to identify the 10 most important things to be done in that week. So the new approach is that in the weekly meeting with an individual senior executive, the question would be, okay, so what are the 10 most important things to get done, this week? Identify those and work on those. So by having a focus on the important stuff, things did improve, but to his surprise, not by much. And he realized that even though he was identifying the important stuff, the focus was good, but it wasn't enough. He needed more focus on the important stuff. So instead of top 10, he switched to top 5. What are the 5 most important things to get done this week? And things improved a little bit again, but then also not by much. So then top 3. So what are the most important 3 items that you have to work on this week? Focus on those. So again, things improved, but again, not by a whole lot with the top 3 versus the top 5 or the top 10. He finally landed on the top 1. So no longer the top 10, no longer the top 5, not even top 3, just top 1. So then that meeting every week turned into a simple question. What is the one thing you can do this week that will make everything else easier or unnecessary? Identify that one thing. What happened next shocked him, shocked his executives, and everyone else that knew about this real estate company. It exploded. It took off in a good way. That company began to expand. It began to do so well that for 9 years, he had around 40% growth year after year. If you grow something by 40% every year for 9 years, the compound growth of that is incredible. So there was something that he stumbled upon here. So Gary realized that somehow, some way, top 1 was way the heck more powerful than top 3 or top 5 or top 10. A result that was really surprising to him because, like everyone else, he was always under the impression that you got to take care of your most important priorities, plural. So identify maybe just a handful. Well, a handful is not the one. There's something that's very interesting that happens when you focus on just one thing. So why and how? What is the secret of this one thing? Okay, we'll talk about that in this very slide. But let me ask everyone this question. What would happen if you also tried this one thing approach every week? That is, what if every week you look at what you have to do and you ask yourself that same question? What is the one thing that, if it's accomplished, would make everything else easier or unnecessary? There's always that one thing. Now here, I'm presenting the one thing in a tactical sense. That is, day to day, week after week, month after month. Please keep in mind that when we talk about the one thing, it's not strictly in a tactical sense. There's also the strategic sense in terms of your entire life. We're going to get to that. So there's a one thing that's the most important in any given moment, but if you take a step back, look at your entire life, there is also a one thing that is the most important to you out of this entire life journey. That's coming up next. For now, please entertain this other question. What would happen if you apply the last line of chapter 21 to your life literally? What if every week you ask, how will you experience the Tao in your life today? And what if the answer is with this? Now, it's guaranteed to change your life, but you have to know what this is. It's exactly as Cowboy Curly, Jack Palance's character, says. Now you just have to figure out what this is so you can get totally into it. So, assuming that you do figure out what this is, I can imagine the objection to Cowboy Curly's philosophy being something like, well, other things are important too. I cannot neglect them. Well, here's the secret about the one thing. When you're done with the one thing, you'll be ready for the next one thing, whatever that is. And the secret of the one thing is that getting it done doesn't just cross it off your list. It also boosts your confidence and effectiveness for the next one thing. So there can be, just like it is in that company, the CEO, Gary, the CEO, is mentoring his senior executives. After they get done the one thing, they will be looking for the next one thing. So this is very much the Tao in action. The Tao is not opposed to having a to-do list. Rather, the Tao is focusing on extracting the one thing from that to-do list. And after you're done with that, go back to the list and seek the next one thing. When you do this, every time you get that one thing done, you become more powerful. You're able to approach the next one thing with greater effectiveness, greater confidence, greater efficiency, greater power. So imagine that these one things, this series of one thing after another, is like a row of dominoes. So when you knock over one domino, that's the one thing, its energy carries you into the next one thing. Indeed, one effect that's been noted is that when you tip one domino over, it has enough energy to tip over not just another one of the exact same size, as you see in this photo here, but it is able to tip over a domino that is 50% larger. That's, slightly larger than the one before. And that domino, when it tips over, can get another one done that's even a little bit larger. So this is what Gary, the CEO, meant when he said, when you get this one thing done, it'll make other things unnecessary or easier. You increase your power effectively. So this concept of knocking over ever larger dominoes, starting for something that may be small, but leads to larger and larger effects, this is spoken of in chapter 63 of the Tao Te Ching. So we went through this last year, and if you take a look from line 6 to line 11 of 63, that's exactly what it's telling you. And it's a clue to us that when we're focusing on the one thing here, using dominoes as a metaphor, we're actually on the right track. So in 63, it says, plan difficult things through the simplest tasks. Achieve large tasks through the smallest tasks. The difficult tasks of the world must be handled through the simple tasks. The large tasks of the world must be handled through the small tasks. So the idea is that you start with the small task. You start with the smallest domino, which at that moment is the initialization or the most important beginning point. Allowing that accomplishment to feed its energy into you, making you more powerful so you can tackle the next smallest, the next simplest, and the result over time is phenomenal ability to accomplish whatever you want. So this is the secret. So now I want to talk a little bit about selecting the one. The reason why I want to talk about that selection is because it echoes another theme from this particular chapter when we talk about patterns in life. This chapter says that within the lack of clarity of the Tao, within the vagueness of the Tao, you can see this image That is the pattern embedded into reality. There are certain patterns that we can notice that are always there. They're all manifestations of the Tao. So how does that apply to selecting the one thing? Well, to answer that question, I want to take you back to about 100 years ago, roughly 100 years ago, to the turn of the previous century at the time that the Titanic sailed. So Italian economist, he was actually more than an economist. He was also a master of many other disciplines. But this gentleman's name, Vilfredo Pareto, we'll just call it an Italian scholar. From about 100 years ago, one of the studies that he made in studying economic issues was that he noted everything in life tended to be unevenly spread out in an 80-20 pattern. So he first noticed this when he looked at the distribution of land ownership in Italy 100 years ago. So he noticed that the majority of the land, 80% of it, was owned by 20% of the people, by a minority of the people. And when he turned to other studies of the economy, he noticed the same pattern repeating itself over and over again. It wasn't just land ownership, it was also about net worth. That is, the wealthiest 20% of the Italian population commanded 80% of the wealth in Italy. Not only that, but he could also drill down into the 80-20 pattern by looking at the 20% that commanded 80% of the wealth. And within that 20%, he would further note that the pattern holds steady even when you restrict your attention to the 20% of the wealthiest Italians. Among them, there would also be a 20% of the 20% that commanded 80% of the 80%. So the pattern holds. Indeed, it applies everywhere. And it can certainly be applied to the concept of this, the one thing. So there's a little quiz coming up. So I want to ask everyone to pay attention to the following. So just imagine that you have 100 things to do, literally 100 things. You can line them up, you can number them. They go from 1 to 100. So out of 100 things to do, there's gonna be 20 of them that will be far important than the remaining 80 items, because that's 20%. So according to the Pareto principle, those who understand this and focus their effort on the 20% shall do well in life. Okay, so that's number one. 20 items out of 100 will be more important, significantly more important, several times more important than the remaining 80 items. Then the next step is what we call recursion in programming. In recursion, you apply the same algorithm to the results of the algorithm. So in this case, it means we apply 20% to the 20%. So out of the 20 items, 4 of them will be far more important than the remaining 16 items. So 4 is 20% of 20 items. Now, take a step back and think about what you have done. You have, out of 100 items, identified the 4 that have the utmost importance. Now, I think you are ready for number 3, not a trick question, just an application of logic. The number is not going to work out exactly, but it's close. Number 3. So what happens out of the 4 items? How would you apply Pareto to that? And I'll pause for a moment so you can give me your brilliant insights. So that is correct. 20% of 4 gives you 0.8. Okay, that's close enough to the 1. When you apply the Pareto principle recursively one more time, you boil down 100 things to one thing. So that is the selection. That is the identification. Now, the other things are just as important, but you don't need to worry about them for the time being. You just have the one thing to focus on. So let's talk about the strategic level. It's not just about day-to-day. That's tactical. It's all about life that's strategic. So to use an example to illustrate that, I want to talk about a friend who recently went on a trip. When I say recent, it's actually from 3 years ago. So recent is relative. Now, he said that the experience changed his life. So as he traveled to the Middle East, to Israel specifically, part of the trip was a tour to a kibbutz. A kibbutz is a communal settlement. It's a farming collective. And so it's one of the agenda items of the trip to learn the history of the kibbutz. So the kibbutz were established many, many decades ago, and young people from Eastern Europe traveled to the Middle East, to Israel, to live in the kibbutz, to farm the land. This was easier said than done because as often as not, the land that was given to them were the land that others did not want. So in some cases, just, desert. No irrigation and seemingly no possibility to farm anything. But they threw themselves into the task. These young people from Eastern Europe were so inspired that even though they suffered a lot of hardship, they didn't care. They knew that from a historical perspective, that they had a chance, they had this opportunity to build the nation of Israel. It inspired them, that vision. Israeli hands working Israeli soil, producing Israeli produce. That was something that inspired everyone, despite the hardship and the primitive surroundings. So they had, the most primitive dwelling. They didn't have beds. They had haystacks to sleep on. But because of the inspiration, because of the goal and the vision, they were so inspired that they jumped off the haystack in the morning, ready and excited for another day's work. So part of the tour that my friend went on was the question that these pioneers found the one thing that inspired them, that caused them to jump off the haystack in the morning, ready and excited for another day's work. The question then became, what about you? What is the one thing for you that would inspire you so much that you too would jump off your haystack in the morning, ready and excited for another day? What is that thing? Have you found it yet? So My friend told me that, I'm older than the others in the tour group, so I was a lot more cynical. Some of these were teenagers that went on the trip, so they were easily swayed by that. But for me, I just thought, oh, they're just being emotionally manipulative. But because my friend studied the Tao, he took a step back and he considered that, well, even if that is the case, there's a useful lesson I can extract from here. I can be inspired even if I feel like they're being manipulative. So he asked himself the same question. So what if here's something that I can benefit from? No matter what, no matter how it is presented, here's a question that I can ask myself. How about you? Is there one thing that can make you jump off your haystack in the morning? So for his tour group, they all eventually decided to pitch in and get some t-shirts made with that exact saying. What is the one thing that makes you jump off your haystack in the morning? And this is the reason why he came back telling me that the experience changed his life. He said, I haven't found the exact one thing for me as of yet, but now I know that I am on a quest for the one thing. I want to extend his insight to everyone who's listening to me and to suggest that indeed, this is a worthy quest. It's something that I would also encourage you to take on. If you haven't found your one thing yet, I would encourage you to be on a quest for the one thing. If you have found the one thing, congratulations. It really puts the spring in your steps. It puts a smile on your face. And yes, it gets you up in the morning, energetic, enthusiastic, and ready to face the day. So that is the very last thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to the one thing. Now, I think we are ready for the paraphrase. Dao De Jing 21. As ever, our purpose is to demonstrate complete understanding by expressing the original meaning in our own words. So here we are, looking at the chapter, and we have to be careful to convey the original meaning exactly as Lao Tzu intended. So, section 1. Whenever sages with great virtues appear in the world, they follow only the Tao. What is this Tao, and how can we come to a better understanding of it? It seems so vague and mysterious. Nothing about it is clear. In the next section, we go into a description of this unclear and vague and mysterious Tao. And here's the paraphrase. The Tao seems vague and undefined as a concept. But as we study it and look deeper into it, we can perceive wonders. Within the Tao, we see the image of patterns embedded everywhere in nature. Within the emptiness of its void, we see the infinite potential, the creation of all living things that ultimately come from nothing and nowhere. These are all aspects of its essence, which is incredibly profound and supremely real. This is the Tao in which we all believe. It is the path we follow. And now the conclusion of chapter 21 of the Tao Te Ching. From the beginning of time to now, the name of the Tao has remained ever constant. We observe the world and see it at work as the source of everything. How do we better understand its nature? By focusing on the one, the oneness of existence in the present moment. So the top part of the summary you have already seen from last time. It's focusing on the one, which maps to the very last line of chapter 21, when Lao Tzu says, how do I know the nature of the source? With this. This is the one. And the most important question, if you recall, when we got to the end of that discussion, was the question about the one thing for you in life. What's the one thing for you? What makes you jump off your haystack in the morning? Have you found it? If you have not found it, then the question then becomes, how will you explore and examine your life in order to figure out what it is? So, what is the quest for the one thing for you? So that's the overall strategic level about the meaning, the purpose of your life. Now, let me talk about daily practice. When we talk about the one thing, I want to reiterate the importance of daily practice, especially with the stuff that we talked about today in regards to the one thing. It would be wonderful, it will be phenomenal if everyone can start using this chapter in a practical way by applying it to everyday life. So here's what I mean specifically. Suggestion number one, starting with develop the mental habit to pare down everything. Apply the 80-20 principle everywhere. So no matter what you're faced with, no matter what you see, it could be at work, it could be at home, it could be a hobby that you are involved in, whatever it may be. I want to encourage you to start cultivating the habit to practice the 80-20 principle. Number one. Number two, I want to ask you to remember the concept of recursion. So in programming, the concept of recursion means you apply the same algorithm to a set of data, and then the result of that, you apply the algorithm again. And you do that repeatedly until you get to the one. So do the Pareto recursively at least once. Once gets you from 10 to 2, from 100 down to 20. Repeat as necessary to get you to the one. And usually 2 iterations, 2 recursions will be enough to get to the one, the important thing. Lastly, I would like you to keep in mind that when you do this, you are not actually neglecting the other things that are also important. You are simply, think of yourself as simply setting yourself up to resolve other important things one at a time, sequentially, but with you possessing increasing power. So when you finally come around to resolving one particular issue, you're going to be more confident, more powerful, more effective than you were before. So start with that one thing and see how far it takes you. So I hope that this summary, the first 2 bullet points you've seen last time, but I hope they make more sense this time after our discussion of the one thing. And then 1, 2, 3 are practical steps that I hope will benefit you as you practice the one thing.
Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, May the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.